Why should you care about the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Energy for that matter? Michael Lewis makes a strong case in his new book, and he'll be here to talk about it, The Fifth Risk. What happens when Tana French leaves the Dublin murder squad behind? She'll join us from Dublin to talk about her new novel, The Witch Elm. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, our critics Dwight Garner, Parl Sagel, and Jen Salai will join us to talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Michael Lewis joins us now to talk about his new book, The Fifth Risk. Michael, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you have covered very exciting topics before. Wall Street is exciting. Sports is exciting. The Department of Agriculture is not generally considered exciting. How did you decide to turn to this?
So it wouldn't have been exciting before Trump. I think Trump's electrified all the material. So what happened? Several things at once happened. I just finished a book about Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two Israeli psychologists who studied the way people sort of misvalued risk, mispriced risk. And one of their insights was that if you take a catastrophic risk, something that's like a 1 in a million chance of happening, and make it a 1 in 10,000, it's still very remote, but increase the likelihood 100 times, people don't feel it. And I had this sense when Trump was elected and the way he was approaching governing, that he was doing that across a big portfolio of risks. I thought of one way to think of the federal government is a manager of a giant portfolio of risks, many of them catastrophic, and that people weren't feeling it exactly. And I was stewing on this and about how to write about it when he made Rick Perry the Secretary of Energy. Of course, Rick Perry had said that he thought the Department of Energy should be eliminated when he was on stage in a debate, but he couldn't remember even the name of the place.
Right.
And once he collided with it, he realized, maybe it shouldn't be eliminated because the Department of Energy has nuclear weapons inside of it. And I thought, well, maybe this is the way. Maybe I should kind of follow Rick Perry and see what it means for Rick Perry to be running this place. And then somewhere in all this, I learned that the Obama administration, partly because they were required to by law, and partly because Obama was a responsible person, had essentially had worked for a year to create these briefings for whoever was going to roll into the federal government and run it. And there have been 1,000 people across the government who had spent the better part of a year creating these briefing books, thinking about how to present the government to someone who didn't know anything about it. And these briefings were supposed to happen the day after the election. I mean, they're going to roll, and that's what happened when Obama rolled in to replace Bush. And the Trump people hadn't shown up at all. So then I had a hook. But now I knew and the hook was, I'm going to go get the briefings. I'm going to get the briefings the Trump people never bothered to get and kind of learn about this portfolio of risk and try to get a sense of what we should be worried about and why. That was the start.
And then you ended up covering not just the Department of Energy, but also the Department of Commerce and the Department of Agriculture. I had a selection problem that reminded me a bit of the selection problem I had with The Big Short. In The Big Short, there was a pool of kind of 15 Wall Street guys who had seen the crisis coming or thought they'd seen it coming and made a fortune betting on the collapse of either Wall Street or the housing market. And I wandered around a long time on a casting search, figuring out which ones were the best to tell the story through. Yeah, who were the other good contenders?
There were a lot of them. I mean, there were hundreds of them, but there were 15 of them, and all of them were willing to let me write about them. It was just who could kind of teach the reader the most important things. What was the best way to dramatize this? And in this case, I had essentially 15 cabinet level positions, 15 departments to choose from. And I had to narrow it down. I couldn't do the whole federal government. I wasn't going to keep the reader for more than a couple hundred pages. Mm-hmm. I knew right away it was going to be 3 or 4. And I thought I had some criteria. I thought, one, it's got to be something that I suspect most readers have no idea what it does. And I would just market test this. I'd be at a dinner party and say, anybody tell me what the Department of Commerce does? And nobody had any idea that half the budget went to collecting weather data, and the Department of Energy, most people didn't know. I were like Rick Perry.
Right, we were all Rick Perry there.
So as opposed to the Treasury Department or the State Department where people have some vague idea what it does. I wanted it to be out of the public eye because I thought, among other things, I think the risks are greater when the public's not watching in the Trump administration. And finally, I thought they still had to be very important. So the Department of Education, I mean, nothing's not important in the federal government, but some of it's more important than others. So I spent time in most of the departments. I mean, I talked to people from most of the departments and eliminated things along the way and then figured these are the three I wanted to do. Having said that, I mourn not having written about the State Department, and I mourn not having written about the Department of the Interior. I think you could drop a writer into any one of these places, and he would come away with they're wonderful stories to tell.
I mean, the Department of Education is one that's been written about a lot because of that, the high profile of the appointee. To a lesser extent, Rick Perry, sort of when he came in, there was a flurry of attention and then it kind of died away. So what is Rick Perry doing at the Department of Energy? And what is the Department of Energy supposed to be doing?
It's a really good question what he is doing, because, I dipped out of this story. I mean, the last time I interviewed someone at the Department of Energy was maybe 6 months ago. And what I'm told is he set himself up as a kind of cheerleader, ceremonial head of who isn't all that interested in the place. So you see him tweet a lot about it, but he never got the briefings. Presumably I know more about it than he does because I sat down with people and had them walk me through the whole department. Maybe by now he's accumulated some information. But what does it do? It's a vast science project is what it is. And part of the science project is tending to testing, assembling nuclear weapons. That's a big part of the budget. Another big part of the budget is cleaning up nuclear waste. There are sites in this country, I mean, you wouldn't believe it. It's Soylent Green type post-apocalyptic places. Hanford, Washington. The Department of Energy spends $3 billion a year trying to clean up the remains of the plutonium factories that generated the atom bombs for World War II. You ask the people in the Department of Energy to give you an honest estimate of how long it's going to take to clean the place up. 100 years, $100 billion. I mean, that's not trivial. And what is at stake is there is a giant plume underground of nuclear waste that's slowly drifting towards the Columbia River, which is not that far away. They set it up on the Columbia River because they need the water to cool it was there for a reason. But if it leaches into the Columbia River, it's a catastrophe for the Pacific Northwest. And it's managed in a very short-term way. Things happen there that are very alarming.
But does that predate Trump, or has it always been managed in a short-term way?
Although Trump was the trigger for my story, and Trump is by far the most negligent manager of the federal government we've had in my lifetime, for sure, probably forever. I never thought of it as a story just about Trump. I thought of it as a story about the narrative we have created that has poisoned or at least screwed up the relationship between the society and the government. That this whole notion that the government is filled with lazy, stupid bureaucrats who are kind of dead weight on society is a really dumb story. It's not a true story. And the Department of Energy actually illustrates this. There is within the Department of Energy in this science project a $70 billion loan portfolio and a few $100 million venture capital fund that is responsible for the entire solar power industry. It's responsible for Tesla, the first loans that were given to Tesla. It's the only place where dollars will be allocated to long-term innovation. Industry doesn't do this. If you track back where the innovations that led to the current American economy came from, almost always it started with some government investment. The internet, the iPhone wouldn't exist without government investment. When I think about the government, I think of it as this exquisitely important, exquisitely complicated machine that we've let rust for decades, telling ourselves a story that we need to basically just kick it every now and then to keep it from being too lazy. And this guy's come along and he's got a sledgehammer. Trump has come along and he's going to do really mortal damage to it.
All right, so here's a short-term thinking way of looking at this. If you have things like nuclear cleanup that are 100-year, $100 billion projects, is this potentially 4-year, maybe 8-year term of neglect, a kind of benign neglect, because it's all moving so slowly anyway? Or is he actively doing something in these departments that is making it far worse? Like, how much do we have to worry?
I think we have to worry a lot. And that's just not me saying it. There are people who are kind of professional watchers of the federal government who are independent refs of the situation, and they're terrified. for a few reasons. One is just the people who were in the federal government. In the first year of the Trump administration, 20% of the top 6,000 managers in the government, civil service, senior executive types left. There's a hollowing out of the talent, and there's real talent there. These are not trivial people. The people who are there, a lot of the people in the federal government could be being paid a lot more money in the private sector, and they've been drawn to some mission, whether it's school nutrition or tending the nuclear arsenal or the weather service. They're there because they love the mission and because they know how important the job is. And we've mistreated those people for a long time, but now the level of mistreatment has gotten very high, and the dispersion of those people is a problem. But then there are lots of things that are not so long-term. I mean, the Trump budgets zeroed out both the loan program and the investments in the Department of Energy. Department of Agriculture. Department of Agriculture has a $3 billion research budget, typically always overseen by a scientist, an agricultural scientist. And if you talk to the woman who previously occupied the place, her name is Kathy Wotecki, a distinguished agricultural scientist who'd been in and out of government for 30 years, really knows what she's doing. She says all of this budget right now is one way or another being directed to research tied to climate change. That we're to feed ourselves, we're going to have to think differently about how and where we graze sheep and cows and grow wheat. And the climate change is going to have a big effect on the food supply. Trump appointed to this job a right-wing talk show radio host from Iowa who happened to support him, who has no science background whatsoever. His name is Sam Clovis. Now, he has recently been removed from consideration, and I don't think there's anybody in the job right now, but the neglect of investment right now in the government will have consequences down the road. The bright spot is it may get so bad, and this is the point of the book, it may get so bad that people may wake up and we'll have a different narrative about our government.
How about the budgets? How have those been impacted by the leadership?
Not as badly, right? Trump may say we want to halve the budget for the Department of Commerce, but the budgets of the Commerce Committee in the Senate is going to determine what the budget is. So what's been happening is in the short term, the legislature has been resisting some of Trump's more extreme demands, but it's still all pushing it in a direction. And just because they allocate the money doesn't mean the Trump administration has to spend it. There's a general sense of missions being starved.
I don't want to leave our listeners in a state of mystery about what it is that the Department of Commerce does. We haven't talked about that yet. Who's in charge?
Well, right now, the secretary is Wilbur Ross, who is a former Wall Street guy. The people I talked to who tried to brief him said he was only interested in a very narrow part of what the Commerce Department did, because it was what Trump was interested in, which was trade deals. But in fact, they don't even really do that. There's a trade representative who takes the lead on trade negotiation. The Department of Commerce, if you look at the budget, it's really a Department of Data. I mean, all these places are misnamed. The Department of Agriculture should be called the Department of Rural, I think, is probably a better name for it. But I mean, the Department of Commerce collects. It's the census is in the Department of Commerce. Economic statistics is in the Department of Commerce, and all the weather data is in the Department of Commerce. So it's a massive data collection enterprise, and the value of this data is, if it's actually used properly and made publicly accessible, is unbelievable.
Well, we've heard about what they've been, at least one thing that they're doing with the census, which is to have the citizenship question on it, which does have broad implications. What have we not heard about?
3/4 of the budget of the Commerce Department goes to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And 3/4 of that goes to the weather. So I wrote more about that because that actually seemed the most urgent story. I did go interview the people who had run the census, and they had two fears. One was that the data is going to be corrupted by scaring people from answering it, because that's a citizenship question. But the bigger thing is they haven't organized it. Will it happen? They're behind. They're behind schedule. And it's a massive undertaking. I mean, I can't remember how many people they hired, but it's like hundreds of thousands of people get hired to go out and collect this data. They try to register every person in this country and get information about them. And that information is extremely important. It's the one picture we have of who we are as a society. All kinds of businesses depend on that data. And it's just being neglected is the problem right now. So is there anything good that can be said
about, I mean, you have to ask, you have to wonder. I mean, for so many years, as you've said, it is a misconception and a mischaracterization, and it's not true that these are huge bureaucracies that do nothing. Nonetheless, presumably these are institutions that could use some kind of change. Is there anything good in this change?
Well, as I said, that one unintentionally good thing may be that he so disables the federal government that we all wake up and realize its importance, and there starts to be some energy behind genuine reform of the place. I mean, the pay scale, for example, there's a pay scale that's in place that was put in place in a pay structure in the 40s. And it was premised on the idea that everybody in the government's a clerical worker. So the pay in the government has not kept up at all with the private sector. Getting a scientist to move from a corporation into the government, even when we really need him to do it, is difficult. The flexibility to hire and fire is a real problem. The average hire takes 106 days. The age of the federal government, there are 5 times more people over the age of 60 than under the age of 30 in the government. That's like the reverse of the private sector. I mean, certainly of Wall Street. Goldman Sachs probably the opposite. And the technology in the government, $90 billion is spent on technological infrastructure, like the computers that run the tax system. 70 billion of that is spent just keeping up ancient systems from like the 60s. So there needs to be there needs to be a radical, but investment in the government, basically.
Right.
That's what needs to happen.
In order to get sort of young, smart graduates with computer science degrees to want to actually go in there.
So the backlash to Trump might be that. Mm-hmm. There might be a new narrative about all this. That's the silver lining.
All right. I want to talk a little bit about the mechanics of this book, because you approach this in a different way from your previous books, which is to say you did part of this on audio before you did it in print. And I'm curious if that changed the process at all, sort of talking out your book before putting it down on paper in its final form.
A little bit. I have read my books before for audiobooks, not in the last few, but, in the Liar's Poker, that kind of thing. And I found when I read the book, I pulled out a pencil, even though the book was the book already. Yeah. And I realized some sentences could be better. So it improved the prose to have to speak in. It also encouraged me to let a couple of characters breathe who I might not have let breathe quite as much. It gave me a license to just kind of tell the story a bit more. And I think that audio does do that. I think that you're slightly different in the way you tell a story when you're on a stage talking to an audience than when you're alone in a room with a pencil. You're more attuned to the emotional effects of the stuff on the page, I think. So I think it had subtle effects, not massive effects. So
you torture us a little bit on the journalism end here by your books come and we have no idea what they're going to be about and they land at the last minute.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. But what's next?
I don't know. I didn't finish this till 2 months ago. And I do think that every time I publish a book, I need to take a few months and ask myself, should I really write another? Because I think writers who have a market for their books, they just start to generate them. And I don't want to ever do that. I want to feel like each one is its own real mission. So I will wait a few months before I even decide and think about it, that I'm still a writer.
I have one last question. You dedicated this book in memory of Tom Wolfe, the lead writer. Why?
He meant the world to me. Pulling Radical Chic off my father's shelf when I was maybe 12 or 13 and reading it, even though I had no idea who the Black Panthers were or Leonard Bernstein, I was rolling around on the floor of our house in New Orleans laughing. And I remember distinctly having this thought, someone wrote this book. And that had not occurred to me at any book I'd ever read. You read the Hardy Boys or Legends of the NFL. And the idea there was an author, they were just books. Books were books. And all of a sudden I had a sense of a writer. His voice was so strong and that a writer was giving pleasure. And I traced my interest in being a writer to that moment. And he couldn't have been sweeter to me in the beginning of my career. And I became very fond of him. And I thought, well, I wanted to dedicate the next one to him anyway. But he always said, one of the subjects that he avoided was politics in Washington. He thought it was boring. He thought that American democracy, he said at one point in one of his letters, that it's like this train that's rolling down the tracks and people will scream at it from the right and people will scream at it from the left, but it's just going to keep rolling down the tracks. And says, Richard Nixon steps down and are we going to have a revolution or a coup? Give me a break. I think now that's no longer true.
I was going to say, you prove him a little bit wrong here in this book.
Yeah.
All right, Michael, always a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The book is called The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis. It's reviewed this week in the Book Review. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Tana French joins us now. Her new book is called The Witch Elm. It's reviewed this week on the cover of the Book Review by Stephen King. It was also reviewed by Janet Maslin. And it is quite a book. Tana, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me on.
I loved this book, and I have so many questions, some of which I can't ask because I'm religiously opposed to plot spoilers. So let's try to avoid them for the sake of readers who haven't read this book yet. Let's start off with the fact that this is your first novel outside the Dublin Murder Squad. Why did you leave that?
Well, I think there's always the risk if you're writing, especially if you're writing in the same genre where the framework is pretty fixed, that you're going to fall into the temptation of writing the same book over and over, and I never want to do that. And I realized that I had looked at the process of a murder investigation from the detective's viewpoint half a dozen times, but I'd never looked at it from all the other viewpoints that are out there, the witness and the suspect and the perpetrator and the victim. But I kept coming back to those. They were interesting to me because for a detective, all the procedural stuff is a source of control and power. He's the one driving it, or she is the one controlling it and using it to restore order and bring things back under control. But from all those other viewpoints, that has to look very different. It's not a source of control. It's something that takes away control and agency. It's this alien, frightening, terrifying, in fact, thing that comes in and turns their lives upside down, and that they never know quite what is going on with it. It's a very mysterious thing, the process of an investigation itself. And I wanted to give a voice to all those other viewpoints. And the narrator, Toby Hennessy, at various points in the book, is all of those. He's witness, victim, suspect, perpetrator, all of it.
I want to talk about the origins of this book, in particular because one of my very astute colleagues here was just doing a rereading of your first novel, In the Woods, from 2007, and she came across this passage, which I will just quickly read. They even searched the trees, you know that, she said. After a few weeks, some smart floater remembered an old case where a kid climbed a hollow tree and fell into a hole in the trunk. He wasn't found till 40 years later. Did you think about this? Did this date back, this concept of a dead person in a tree?
No, actually it didn't. I had kind of forgotten about that line in the woods until my brother sent me a link to the true story of Bella in the Witch Elm. In 1943, 4 kids in England climbed up a tree and found down a hole in it a human skull, and the rest of the skeleton followed after that. And it turned out to be the skeleton of a woman who had died within the last 18 months, but nobody knows who she was or how she got there to this day. And in the years after that, and until relatively recently, graffiti appeared around the area saying, "Who put Bella down the Witch Elm?" Now, who knows why they called her Bella, why they knew or assumed her name was Bella. But my brother sent me a link to this, along with a note that said, well, this sounds like a Tana French novel. I wasn't sure whether I should be flattered or disturbed. Mm-hmm. But anyway, it clicked something into place in a lot of stuff that I'd been thinking about. And I wound up with a story where there does, in fact, turn out to be a skull down the trunk of a witch elm.
For those who haven't yet read it, set up the story for us a little bit without describing too much of the plot. Tell us about the Witch Elm.
Well, the protagonist, the narrator, is Toby Hennessy, who's a happy-go-lucky young guy who's always basically led a charmed life. He has a lovely job in PR, which he enjoys. He's got a great girlfriend. He's got great friends. And nothing particularly bad has ever happened within his life. So he's sort of bopping along through life in a state of cheerful oblivion until one night he isn't anymore because he's surprised by burglars in his apartment who beat him half to death and leave him for dead. And when he comes to, he's got the after effects of traumatic brain injury, including a certain amount of trouble with speech, with memory, with executive function, organizational skills, a limp, and he's also got post-traumatic stress disorder. And so not only does the world seem like a very different place, it's not this essentially benign thing that he can drift through getting away with everything. It's a frightening, quicksandy kind of place. But he also is an entirely different thing to himself. He's no longer this physically and mentally healthy, able for anything guy. His body and his mind have turned into tricky places, untrustworthy places. And it's a very frightening place for him to be. And he kind of retreats to lick his wounds to the family house where his uncle is living, the Ivy House, with his girlfriend. And while he's there and sort of starting to put the pieces of himself back together again a little bit, that's when the skull turns up and suddenly there's a murder investigation all up in their faces.
I thought you did such interesting things with your main character, Toby Hennessy, because he's essentially, as you said, happy-go-lucky, but in a lot of ways a kind of thoughtless guy. Doesn't think too much about himself, or certainly not about other people. And it's only after suffering brain damage, which in fact impedes his ability to think, that he starts to actually want to think and to need to think about the way he conducts his life and about the way he sees himself and others.
Absolutely. What you said there, he doesn't need to think up until that point. That's kind of where the book came from. I had been thinking a lot about luck and how it can actually stunt empathy. If we're too lucky in any one area of life, it can be quite difficult to realize that other people may be experiencing life very differently and that their experience is nevertheless just as real as ours. I mean, the example I use is I had a happy, loving childhood. And so when I was younger, when I was a teenager, if somebody told me about something in their childhood that was truly awful, a part of my brain would go, that can't really have been that bad. They must be exaggerating, mustn't they? And it wasn't that I thought the person was lying or disbelieved them. It was just that it was so outside my frame of reference that I didn't see how it could possibly be real because I had never had to think about this or explore this or be aware of alternate possibilities. Now, I mean, I grew up and I realized that my frame of reference isn't in fact the be-all and end-all for everybody. But I started thinking a lot about a guy who had been lucky his whole life in every way, who had drawn the high card on every draw. He's white, male, straight, affluent. He's physically healthy, mentally healthy, good-looking, from a stable family, loved. He has basically drawn all the high cards. And what would that do to both his ability and his inclination to think about life from other perspectives, to think about the experience of people who have, in fact, drawn lower cards in some or all areas? Would he be able to accept this as real? And would it ever even occur to him to try? And then what would happen if suddenly he wasn't lucky anymore?
I thought you tweaked reader expectations in so many ways, and you touched on one of them just there, which is that you're taking someone for whom the reader might not ordinarily have sympathy for and turning him into an inherently sympathetic character, a victim. And in addition, and I'm curious as to what extent this was deliberate, we're very familiar with the unreliable narrator lately. It's been a big type in a lot of recent psychological thrillers, but usually, recently at least, it's been a woman, whether it's because of drink or drugs or some kind of obsession. Here you have a man, and he's unreliable because he has brain damage. Did you do that deliberately to kind of tweak that formula?
No, definitely didn't do it deliberately. He just showed up in my head as a guy necessarily to the story because, being a guy is in this society an easier difficulty setting than being a woman. So if he were going to be the person who had gone through life with everything on the easiest difficulty setting, it was necessary for him to be a guy. But I think, I love unreliable narrators to begin with. I think they go to the heart of everything that's most important about the arts, which is that the arts, a good book, play, song, poem, sculpture, anything, gives us the chance to catch a glimpse of what life is through different eyes. So not only are you seeing that other people share some of these feelings you've had and seeing those feelings articulated, but you're also seeing that everybody's reality is unique and that other people are experiencing life and their experience is real and it is different from yours. And in some ways, that's at its height, at its most intense with unreliable narrators. Because we are all unreliable narrators. We all see life through our own needs and our own biases and our own fears. And so when you're seeing, story, song, any world within the arts, through the eyes of an unreliable narrator, through all those fears and biases, that's when you come closest to that person. And that's when you are closest to the core of what make the arts so important and so valuable. So I think we need unreliable narrators from every single demographic so we can have a connection to all those kinds of reality. But I think it is, not that I did it consciously, important to have unreliable male narrators because we're so used to seeing the female narrative as inherently unreliable and the male narrative as inherently objective. This is the default perspective. And anything else is deviation from it, which can be interesting, it can be valuable, it can be mysterious, but it is inherently a deviation. So the female narrator is positioned as having something inherently a little off-kilter.
You don't say.
Yeah, really. As we see all over the place in real life and in fiction. While the male narrator is by default considered reliable. So I think there is something. Again, I'm not going to take credit for having done it on purpose, but I think there is something interesting in having a male narrator who is unreliable and who is openly unreliable and recognizes himself as such.
You just said a very interesting thing, which is that you're not going to take credit for having done it on purpose, yet of course you did do it. You were the author of this, so you must have set out in some way to do this, even if not quite consciously. I also thought, you talk about this novel being in large part about luck, but to that point of unreliable narrators, to me it felt like a book about memory and about memory as essential to storytelling, particularly the stories we tell about ourselves and family stories, which rely so much on the very differing perspectives of all of the various characters that were there.
I think the narratives that we construct within memory and the narratives that we construct from our memories are essential to our sense of identity of who we are. And we shape those and reshape them to fit the narratives that we want to construct about ourselves. And then it can be a huge shock to find out that maybe some of the other people who were participants in that narrative at the time do not remember them the same way, that they've focused on different bits or they've reshaped them differently and maybe they're right and maybe you're wrong and this is a possibility. And this is something that Toby comes up against with a bang and a wallop in the course of the book because he has, this family home, the Ivy House, which to him has been absolutely idyllic. It's childhood picnics and it's forts in the spare room and it's sleep outs in the garden and teenage parties and first kisses. That's what this place is to him. And that's what, in his own mind, he is constructed of. He and his two cousins, Susanna and Leon, were this lovely little trio where he kind of took care of them because they weren't as cool as he was, but he was the cool cousin and looked after them and everything was lovely. But in the course of the book, as the detectives start peeling back the layers of their past and asking questions, and he starts asking questions to find out what might or might not have gone on, he realizes that Susanna's and Leon's memories and their narrative only intersect with his at certain points, and the rest of the time they do not have a lot in common. And that's a huge shock to him because he's at a point where his sense of self has been smashed, and the one thing that he thinks he might be able to use to reconstruct it is that shared past, which he considers to still be stable. But as he realizes that their narrative and their memories are not the same as his and are much darker, and that not only their past, but their relationship with him and all the events of that past are not the same from their perspective, his past starts to be destabilized as well.
One of the things I liked about that sort of unveiling of the past through these different perspectives, it was almost like Rashomon-like, where you tell a certain story about yourself and about your family, and then he hears it. It's like it turns, and then you hear it through another family member's eyes, and you have to kind of reconstruct the way that you see it now based on that new information, and that you kind of keep returning to certain central events of the novel, but from a shifting perspective, and then a kind of reconstructive narrative with this new information.
Well, I'm fascinated by that Rashomon-style idea or effect or whatever you want to call it, because it comes back to what I was thinking about with this book, is that other people have their realities. And to what extent do you recognize them? To what extent are you aware of them? To what extent do you feel attacked or undermined by them? And to what extent are you able to hold on to your own reality in the face of the fact that other people's are real too? Where's that balance? And he's unable to find that balance because he's never, as we said, had to even consider the fact that other people might have their realities too. That's never even been on his horizon. And so when it is forced upon him, he's unable to find a balance between holding any sense of his own center, which is, of course, not in great shape as it is, and allowing for theirs.
All right, this is the hardest question, and it's because I want to try to ask it and see if you can answer it without any plot spoilers. This novel,
okay.
Let's see if we can do it. This novel is so of this moment. Did you deliberately set out to write about something that is very much percolating in the culture, or are you just psychic?
I'm going to go for neither one. I'm writing this in a time where people are thinking a lot about who gets to define what the reality is and about whose reality should be listened to. And in a time where many people who have not drawn the high card in one area or another of life are less and less willing to be silenced and to be marginalized, and who are speaking up to say, hang on, my narrative matters as well. My narrative is real. My narrative has as much weight as anyone else's. And also a time in which people who have always been able to set the narrative and who have always been considered by default as the objective standard of reality, they don't like the idea that they no longer get to set the narrative. Some of them are very angry about that. And so that tension is running all through society. And if you're seeing it and thinking about it in daily life and reconsidering your own assumptions about it that you've always held and taken for granted, I think it's naturally going to come through in the book. Was that non-spoilery?
Yeah, we did not reveal the ending, but it leads me to ask you another question, which is, do you always know the ending? Do you start knowing where exactly you're going to end up?
Oh, God, no. No, I don't know anything, basically. I'm not one of the authors who have like this full outline and know exactly the shape of the book when they start. And I'm in awe of that, and I kind of envy it because at least then you know there's going to be a book there. But for me, no, I start with, I've got a very strong sense of the narrator, I've got a strong sense of the basic premise, and I've got a core location, usually. And from there on, I just dive in and write and figure it out as I go along and just keep my fingers crossed that there is, in fact, a book in there somewhere. I kind of figure it comes from having been an actor where I'm starting everything from character rather than from plot, because it means that I have to write the characters for a while before I get to know them enough to know who would do what. Like, I don't even know who done it when I start the book. I figure it out halfway through and go, oh, of course, that makes sense. And then I have to go back and rewrite to make sure that it all is properly rooted and seeded in the beginning of the book.
But perhaps there's something more naturalistic then about how that comes across to the reader, because the person who knows the ending is kind of planting the MacGuffins and things along the way. Whereas if the writer doesn't even necessarily know, then everything is sort of full of mystery and possibility, and you don't have to kind of plant anything because that's the way the landscape looks.
Well, I certainly hope so, because I do have those moments where something comes as a very startling revelation to me as well. You know, drop what I'm doing and go into my husband in the other room and go, oh my God, I think this is going to happen. And nod it away going, that sounds good. And I've startled myself. So I sort of hope that some of that revelatory quality comes through to the readers.
All right, I have to ask you two more questions about other books. The first is, are you going to go back to the Dublin Murder Squad?
I don't know. I kind of assume so, but I figure it would be good to take a little while and a little while away from it and come back to it with fresh eyes. Like the one I've just started working on now is another standalone. So the Dublin Murder Squad I'm not going back to it immediately, but it's definitely on the plan for some time.
All right. And then lastly, because everyone I know is reading The Witch Elm, I have to ask, what are you reading?
I have just finished reading Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, which is an amazing book. I don't know how it hadn't come on my radar before, because I like great big epics. I like books that take you with characters along a huge journey. And there isn't much, you don't get much bigger of a journey than this. You know, these men driving this huge herd of cattle from Texas all the way up to Montana. And it's a wonderfully done book where you dip in and out of various characters' viewpoints and get to see them more and more deeply as the book goes on and get more and more of an insight into their world. And I'm loving it.
All right. Well, there's a book recommendation for you. Tana, thank you so much for joining us from Dublin.
And thank you so much for having me.
The book, again, is called The Witch Elm by Tana French. It's reviewed this week on our cover by Stephen King. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new this week?
So we are now in the middle of literary award season, and the National Book Foundation announced the finalists for this year's National Book Award. And it was a pretty interesting group of authors. There's 25 finalists. And to me, the most interesting thing this year is that they are including works in translation for the first time in decades. I guess in the 1980s, they had a prize for that, but not since then. So it was really fascinating to see which translated works made the cut, as well as, you know, looking at the always exciting categories of fiction and nonfiction.
I have a question about the translation prize. Is it about the translation itself and the translator, or is it about the book?
That is a great question. And I think it's a combination. I think they're honoring the translator. And in fact, they name the translator and the author as part of the prize, and they each are awarded some amount of money. So I do think they are honoring the translation, but I think they're looking at books that either they're very interesting in terms of their style, or they speak to some issue that's going on in some part of the world today. So I think it's a combination.
And there was some controversy around this idea, right? Because this is supposed to be the National Book Awards, the American Book Awards,
exactly.
Not the international. Just the way that the man Booker allowed Americans in, we're kind of letting in other people.
Yeah, it's a globalization of the National Book Awards. I mean, it's almost a contradiction in a way, but I think it's kind of interesting because one of the reasons they did it, and it was a unanimous vote by the board of the National Book Foundation, was to kind of encourage American readers to take greater notice of works in translation historically. Although there have been some breakout authors here, like Elena Ferrante, it's not necessarily been a very strong commercial category. So I think they are trying to draw attention to that area. And the other thing I thought was kind of curious was they definitely are not including English writers.
Right, effectively left out are the Brits and everyone in the Commonwealth.
Exactly, anyone from around the world. There's many writers from Africa, from Asia who write in English primarily, but are addressing issues from those areas of the world. And you'd think they might be up for recognition, but they're not. You have to be in translation. So.
All right, so who are the finalists this year?
So it's a very interesting group. In fiction, there's 5 finalists. Lauren Groff was nominated for Florida. She is often on the shortlist, so it might be her year. Rebecca Mackay is shortlisted for The Great Believers. Sigrid Nunez for The Friend, which was a very well-regarded novel. I think it got a great review by us. And Brandon Hobson for Where the Dead Sit Talking, which is by Soho Press. And Jamel Brinkley for A Lucky Man by Grey Wolf Press. So you're seeing, again, independent presses with a strong showing on the shortlist, as they have in the last few years.
Oxford University Press, which is not a small press, but is an academic press, had 2 books shortlisted this year. I noticed that too,
yes. Colin Calloway's The Indian World of George Washington was one of them.
For nonfiction?
For nonfiction. And Jeffrey Stewart's The New Negro, The Life of Elaine Locke was also shortlisted for nonfiction.
What were the other 3?
The other 3 were Sarah Smarsh Heartland, which was her memoir, which many people are comparing to J.D. Vance, which is a huge bestseller. Victoria Johnson's nonfiction book, American Eden, David Hosack, Botany and Medicine in the Garden of the Early Republic, which was published by Liveright, and another Liveright book, Adam Winkler's We the Corporations, How American Businesses Won Their Civil Rights, was shortlisted as well.
All right. So the other two categories are poetry and young people's literature. Who were the finalists there? What books?
So the young people's literature was interesting this year because it included a novel in verse. That's become a very popular substrain, I think, of young adult literature in particular. That novel is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. The shortlist also included a graphic memoir, Hey Kiddo by Jarrett Krasoska, which we wrote about. He wrote this memoir about his mother's struggle with heroin addiction, which is a really obviously difficult but timely subject. So it's gotten a lot of attention for that. And the other shortlisted books for young people's literature included Leslie Connor's The Truth as Told by Mason Buttle and The Assassination of Brangwain Spurge, which I love that title, by M.T. Anderson and Eugene Yelchin, and The Journey of Little Charlie by Christopher Paul Curtis.
One interesting thing to point out to listeners about the Young People's Literature Award is that unlike the American Library Association's awards, the Caldecott, the Newbery, the Prince, the National Book Award doesn't differentiate between middle grade and young adults. You kind of have a mix of target readers in that group.
Exactly, yeah. And it's pretty broad, and you see a whole range of genres. It's gone to nonfiction, fiction in verse, books in verse. I'm sure there have been picture books probably, although I can't think of one off the top of my head. Yeah, that's an interesting point about this prize.
Last but not least, quickly take us through the poetry finalists.
Sure. So there's, again, I think a kind of interestingly diverse group of authors, including debut poets and well-established ones. Terrence Hayes made the cut for American Sonnets from a Past and Future Assassin, which was a fantastic collection, and it got a great review by our critics. Ray Armentrout's Wobble, which was published by Wesleyan University Press, was a finalist. Justin Philip Reed's Indecency from Coffee House Press was a finalist. Jenny Z's Eye Level from Grey Wolf Press was a finalist. And finally, Diana Coy Nguyen, her collection Ghost of, which was published by Omnidon Publishing, was a finalist. So a lot of independent presses represented there.
All right. When can people find out the winners?
The winners will be announced on November 14th at a ceremony at Cipriani, where it's usually held. It's a really fun night. Everyone in publishing is there. People are really excited. And Isabel Allende will be accepting a Lifetime Achievement Award that night as well.
All right. And if you cannot go to the big fancy ceremony, everyone can read the winners.
That's right.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now are three book critics, Jennifer Salai, Dwight Garner, and Pearl Sagal. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's start with you, Jen, because you had a review that just came out today. Tell us what you read this week.
So I read The Library Book by Susan Orlean. You know, it's one of these books. I mean, she's done this with her other books, too, where she sort of has this idea that she's going to follow something. So there was The Orchid Thief, there was Rin Tin Tin. I think she wrote a book about what people do on Saturday night. And then she just ends up finding sort of these really interesting, obsessive people. And in this case, because her book is about libraries and the role of libraries, not only in her life, but in all of our lives, public libraries specifically, she ends up just sort of taking up residence essentially in Los Angeles Central Library and just finding out how it works. And the occasion for the actual book was that she found out when she moved to Los Angeles, I think about 7 years ago, that there was an enormous fire in 1986 that destroyed more than 1 million books, or at least damaged as many as that. So she takes that story of the library fire and the mystery of what happened and how it may or may not have started and uses that ostensibly as her frame, but then it just turns into an Orlean book where she talks to people and finds out what they're obsessed with and interested in. And it's just like a really enjoyable experience, I'd say. And you sort of come out at the end of it really with a, I think, deeper appreciation of what it is that libraries do. And also just the really sort of, there are some things that happen in libraries that you don't even necessarily think about. And when she talks about how the library adjusted after the fire and how they tried to save some of the books that were essentially ruined by water damage because of the firefighters coming in. And so they put these books into deep freezing for like a couple of years. and then hoped for the best when they thawed out. So it's the whole thing is just very, very interesting and strange. I mean, that was even something I couldn't even find a room to mention that, but that's,
It always strikes me that Susan Orlean is not only allows for tangents, but she allows herself to kind of give in to the tangents. And so
totally,
that might be one of the reasons why it's always very hard to kind of capture her books in a simple...
Yes. And to be honest, I mean, the parts where she tries to sort of contain it with the message about the libraries, those are really the weakest parts of the book. I mean...
Can I ask you a library question?
Sure.
Maybe you'll be up on this. Maybe you won't be. Maybe it's in the book. Maybe it's not.
Okay.
But we all remember, I think, maybe 15 years ago when people like Nicholson Baker were obsessed with the demise of the card catalog.
Right.
And Nicholson Baker was going around, in my mind anyway,
rescuing
card catalogs and putting them in a truck.
I have card catalogs.
Do you?
I do.
I love card catalogs and taking them back to this warehouse in Maine and say, is this still a thing? Is this still an issue? Are card catalogs just being tossed away and burned, or are they being... Do you know anything about this?
So the only thing I can remember from the book that mentions the card catalog is that in the elevator of the central branch of the Los Angeles Library, it's lined with cards from the old card catalog.
Oh, they rescued them and made art out of them.
Yes, essentially. But I think...
I have mixed feelings about that, but it's kind of cool.
You can buy used card catalogs on the internet. I often use them as like note cards when I give talks, and you just...
No, you don't.
Use the other, side?
Yes.
Wait,
it's a dark confession here.
They're written on one side?
Yeah. I had the old typewritten card catalogs with all of the categories and everything, and you can use them as, in place of Post-its or regular index cards.
And they're kind of like nicely...
We're all staring at Pamela agape right now. I think she can't see this.
All of you want me to bring in
I
desperately.
I write on the backs of old receipts. That's amazing.
I got one as a gift from my husband.
Wow.
A whole set, actually, I should say. All right. Dwight, how about you?
I read a novel this week by a youngish writer now named John Ray, W-R-A-Y. His new one is called Godsend, and it's based on the John Walker Lynch case, the American Taliban, the young man who was spectacularly caught in the wrong place at the wrong time after 9/11. He had gone to study at a madrasa and to learn about Islam, and ended up fighting and was captured as an enemy combatant in 2001 or 2. I can't remember now. But anyway, Ray's new novel pretty much follows the traces of Lynn's life, except that it features a young 18-year-old woman from California who disguises herself in Yentl fashion as a man and goes to study and then to fight. It's very serious, very sober, very sort of one of those novels where there are not peaks and valleys. It's one long sort of slow rise to a sort of rather smashing ending. It's impressive. I was amazed at the amount of learning he had clearly absorbed to write this novel. The learning does not come at you in undigested chunks. It's very measured, the entire book, but it's clear that a lot of work went into this. And
he traveled there.
He traveled there. But a lot of people travel and their books aren't so, but
or
you're
it's
right.
too obvious the way that they show that, like, I've been to Pakistan, and I've spent time here.
Exactly. So, this, as I say in my review, it's not really my kind of book. It's the kind of book that's so intent on portraying the inner workings of a mind, giving itself up to religion. And I just lack the spiritual gene, as I say in my review. And so watching someone fall off a cliff into superstition to me is a claustrophobic experience. And that's intentional in this novel.
Hold the connection with the spiritual, because that will lead us into Parl's book this week. But I'm curious, when you say this is not my kind of book, do you like sometimes to deliberately set out to review books that are not your kind of book?
Yeah, we talked about this a few episodes ago.
We're going to talk about it in this episode.
Yeah, but it's one of those issues of permanent fascination to me because, as critics, we're always reviewing. I mean, most of the world's literature runs against the grain of my taste, and it's true of all of us, I think. So, no, I don't set out to. And the thing about books is you don't know what they're going to be. You start reading them, and you're always surprised. John Ray tends to write a different kind of novel every time out, and so I had no idea what to expect with this book. And, a lot of novels have peaks and valleys and ups and downs, and this is not the kind of book. I mean, a famously maligned book about 9/11, about terrorism, was John Updike's novel Terrorism, which frankly I don't think is quite as bad as his critics say. But Updike's novel is a big high and low meditation on religion and culture. And this is the kind of book that it's not that. John Ray's book puts you in the little bubble, in the little capsule heading towards Mars, which is the madrasa, and you're in the bubble and you're just from this limited point of view. That makes it powerful and it makes it limiting at times. But when novels like this work, and this does, I think it's powerful.
Can we gossip for a second?
Sure.
Did you guys read the article in New York Magazine about his house?
Oh, the house.
So he owns this brownstone in Park Slope, I think. Yeah. And he's rented John Ray, and he's rented out bedrooms to writers to use as offices, but they're all like amazing writers. It's like Marlon James is on one floor, Nathan Englander's on another, Akhil Sharma is. And they have this like literary frat house, and they come down and play like, I think it's like ping pong or something when they need a break. No, then there's like one woman, Alice Sola-Kim. But it's kind of like...
They write there, or do they live there?
They don't live there, they just write.
I think Alice Sola-Kim and Isaac Fitzgerald live there.
Yeah. But the rest of them kind of just...
Yeah, it doesn't mention this, but on the back of the book it says that Ray lives in Mexico City, so maybe he has a frat house there. Frat house that's such a Brett Kavanaugh kind of thing now. But I remember
it's a literary frat house.
Sorry, I remember once seeing a photograph that I loved. He once got a tattoo on his back of our former colleague Michiko Kakutani. And
Wait, what?
A huge back, full back.
What?
No, it was temporary. But it was her face, and it said Michiko Forever, I think like EVAH. And he took it off on stage, and it was hilarious. I cannot remember now whether...
Did she positively review his book?
I can't remember now whether she liked or didn't like his novels. I suspect she liked them because they're quite good, but I could be wrong.
You know, I am looking at our producer in the other room, and he is saying, essentially, through his facial expressions, this is staying in the podcast. We're not cutting this out. So, listeners, you all now know about this.
I hope I'm not wrong. It wasn't Salman Rushdie.
As a critic, this is giving me something to aspire to, you know?
You're not nothing until you're a temporary tattoo,
Oh my
Carl.
God, what would they do to it? Horrible. No, never.
All right, let's elevate the conversation to the spiritual realm. Parl's review this week caused a conversation on the floor of the book review in which one editor did not want to edit the review because, as she put it to another editor, you're better at transubstantiation. You do it. What did you review, Parl?
I reviewed, this is just sort of, building off of Dwight's point about reviewing things that are sort of outside of your ken or outside of your taste. I deliberately did that this week. I picked up a book that's, more commercial. It's called Melmoth by Sarah Perry, who wrote a book called The Essex Serpent, which came out, I think, last year or the year before. And it was a hit. People really loved it. And
2 years ago.
2 years ago, yeah. And so I figured that people would be curious about this new book. And then I think I was also kind of interested in reviewing something that felt a little bit more genre. And it was great fun. The book is roughly, I don't encapsulate it. It's roughly, it's the story of this spirit. It's kind of based on the sort of fable of the wandering Jew. And she wanders without respite, sort of haunting people that are very lonely and abject and sort of getting her to join them for some mysterious purposes. And the book opens in the present day in Prague. And there's this woman, we meet Helen, the main character, who just seems to be obscurely suffering. She's doing this incredibly elaborate ritual of private penance. We don't understand. There's clearly something that she has done that's wrong in her past, and she's trying to suffer in the present. And she sort of learns of the story of Melmoth, and Melmoth obviously becomes very interested in her. And like the best ghost stories I write in the review, what keeps you reading this book is that you're never sure, is there even a ghost? Or is this a certain kind of projection of her own secrets and guilt? And, it's an interesting book. It's a really well done book because it also moves into the present, and it sort of moves into these questions of our own feelings of complicity, of our own feelings of what do we owe one another, and how do we sit with our inability to save each other or sit with our inability to grievously hurt each other. So it was a really interesting book. But I will say that, it isn't the kind of book that I would ordinarily read. It's incredibly gothic. It's full of incense and, circling birds and doom and gloom and all of these things. And it was really interesting as I reviewed it, to not hold those things against the book. Those are part of the genre, but to work through in the review, giving, I hope, the reader enough information to be like, this is what it's about. It's like complaining that a musical has songs. Like these are the features of the book. So understand that this is what's happening, understand that, it may not be for you, but there's, luckily to Perry's credit, so much happening. It's a very, very layered book.
I feel like this has been happening to you a lot, Parl, lately, because you had this with Schoen. No, in reading. In life too, perhaps, but in reading, because with the Schoen book, you said, for example, it contained all of these things that, mythological creatures and fairies and, rainbows and I don't know what else that you don't ordinarily like to read about.
That's like, I think this is like one of the best parts of the job is to be able to push yourself, and then to also interrogate, why don't I like this? What does it mean to me? When I have a book about unicorns and stuff like that, and I reflexively dismiss it, what am I missing when I do that?
All right, I want to ask one final question of everyone, since we started with libraries. What's your favorite library?
Ooh. Well, the New York Public Library, come on. It's just so beautiful. But
the main branch.
Yeah.
The main branch. But, for me, sorry to leap it, by growing up, the Naples, Florida, I was born in West Virginia, but I spent my second half of my childhood in Florida. And the place you went when you were a kid, it just, anyway. And I was famous for getting tons of books out, never, ever returning them. So my mother had to pay these awful fines all the time.
Do you still have them?
The books,
yeah.
They were returned eventually. I actually called up this library about a year ago because I was working on some writing about my childhood. And I said, any chance you kept the records? Because I really would want to know what. They said no, they didn't. But card cut.
That's amazing. Like hospital records. You're here for the following books.
I love that about school libraries when you had to handwrite in your name, and the little slip in the back. And it was always kind of fascinating as a social document because you learn things about your classmates that you wouldn't have ordinarily, you wouldn't have suspected, like that, this boy over there took out, a Nancy Drew or whatever, What about you, Parl? Do you have a favorite library?
I think it's like Dwight. I think it's like, I like the libraries that I love in New York, but when you asked me that question, I zoomed back to the libraries of my elementary school years and my high school libraries. And I moved a lot. And I think the one thing I always did when I went to a new school, which is every 2-3 years, was to quickly find the library and orient myself there and to be like, as long as I had my coordinates, I had my roll doll. I had my whatever I needed at that point. I felt a little grounded.
Yeah.
What about you, Jen?
Well, for me, I remember going to the neighborhood library in Toronto where I grew up. And I still remember it very distinctly. Like I remember exactly how it was laid out, where the children's section was, where the YA section was. And then also my university library at Toronto was this enormous, hideous building called Robarts Library, which is this sort of big brutalist structure that I think was intentionally made in the shape of a peacock. If you look at it from a certain distance, it's really weird looking. But I don't know, that to me was sort of the library that I remember really
that like sanctuary.
Yeah. And it was, when you're in the stacks, it was sort of windowless. There was nothing really charming about it, but I have really good memories of it.
What was yours, Pamela?
Well, one point about university libraries at my school, we had, the sort of major main library, the Rockefeller Library, which we refer to as the Rock. And then there was this other library, which I never set foot in, called the Sciences Library or the Sci-Li. And it was also a brutalist structure, not like a peacock, really just like a drop pin. But apparently what interested me about it metaphorically was that the architects had evidently not accounted for the weight of the books in working out the engineering of it. And so the Sci-Li is sinking. I don't know if it's subsequently been reinforced by some kind of generous donation to the school, but I loved the idea that this really ugly sciences library that I had no desire to enter was just going to like sink into a hole in the ground and go away forever. And I'll end on that note. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.